The courtroom had never been that silent. The judge, an old man known for never breaking composure, froze the moment his eyes met mine. The papers slipped from his hand. The gallery leaned forward, confused, waiting for something they couldn't name. No one knew who I really was. Not the lawyers, not my son, not even the woman who tried to take everything from me. But he did. His face said it before his words did. That day wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about recognition, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout to be heard. If you've ever believed that truth always finds its way home, this story will speak to you. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. It helps more people find stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, do you believe kindness ever gets forgotten? Or does it always return in its own quiet way? Now let's begin. When I walked into that courtroom, the air felt heavy, like everyone had already decided who I was. Just another old lady dragged into some family mess, right? My shoes echoed against the marble floor, each step louder than the last, and for a second, even I wondered if I belonged there. Lucas wouldn't meet my eyes. My only son sat at the plaintiff's table next to his wife, Vivian. Legs crossed, face flawless, heart cold as ice. She whispered something to him, and he gave that small, uneasy nod I'd seen 100 times before. The kind you give when you're not sure if you're agreeing or surrendering. People were watching. I could feel their eyes crawl over me. The clerk adjusting her glasses, the young lawyer at the back nudging his friend like, "Can you believe she's the defendant?" The kind of stares that strip away your dignity before you've said a word. But I didn't flinch. I straightened the old cardigan I'd knitted myself years ago, and kept walking until I reached my seat. My hands were shaking, but I laced my fingers together, like my husband Richard used to do when life tested him. Then, something unexpected happened. The judge looked up. His pen froze midair. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he leaned forward, eyes narrowing, confusion flickering across his face. "Miss Price?" he said quietly. "Is it really you?" The courtroom went dead silent. Even Vivian stopped pretending to scroll through her phone. Lucas turned, eyes wide, as if he was suddenly seeing me for the first time. I didn't say a word. I just met the judge's gaze and gave a small, polite nod, nothing dramatic, just enough to say, "Yes, I'm still here." Inside my heart was pounding, but not from fear. It was something else, a strange mix of calm and fire. Because in that single moment I remembered something my husband once told me. Dignity doesn't make noise, Ellie. It just stands tall. So that's what I did. I stood tall. The bailiff cleared his throat. Papers shuffled, someone coughed. But the silence lingered, like the whole room was waiting for a secret to unfold. And maybe it was. Because no one there, not my son, not that woman he married, not even the lawyers, knew who I really was. To them, I was just an aging widow living alone in a house too big for her. Someone easy to manipulate. Someone they could push aside. But they were about to find out that even the quietest women can carry thunder in their bones. The clerk finally spoke. "Court is now in session." The judge's eyes lingered on me one last time before he looked down at his notes. But I could tell he remembered me. The way a teacher remembers a student who once changed their life. I just didn't know how yet. As I sat down, my knees creaked louder than I wanted them to. And for a second, embarrassment stung. But then I thought, let them hear it. Every sound of these old bones is proof that I've stood my ground longer than they've been alive. Across the aisle, Vivian smirked, probably thinking she'd already won. She had that smile, the kind that hides behind politeness but carries poison underneath. Lucas kept glancing between us, torn, ashamed. He used to hold my hand when he was nervous. Now he avoided my eyes like I was a stranger. Funny how fast love turns into something else when money gets involved. I rested my hands on the table and stared at the papers in front of me. Legal documents, accusations, signatures that meant nothing but betrayal. My name was there, Eleanor M. Price, printed in black ink like an obituary. I exhaled slowly. My lawyer whispered something about letting her handle the talking, but I barely heard her. My mind was somewhere else, in the kitchen I built with Richard, where sunlight used to hit the counter just right in the morning, in the sound of Lucas's laughter when he was a boy. I thought of the cracked teacup still sitting on the counter at home, the one I refused to throw away. "A small crack doesn't ruin the cup," Richard once said. "It just proves it's been used with love." I wondered if that's what was happening to me. Just another old cup, cracked but still useful, holding on to what's left of warmth. Then Vivian's voice cut through the air like static. "Your Honor, my husband and I are only here out of concern for Ms. Price's well-being. She's not capable of maintaining her property safely anymore." Her tone was sugary, fake concern dripping from every syllable. I felt 100 eyes swing back to me, waiting for me to crumble, to deny it, to cry. But I didn't. Instead I smiled, just a small calm smile, because I'd already decided something before walking into that room. I wasn't there to beg. I wasn't there to explain. I was there to be seen, really seen, for the first time in years. The judge cleared his throat, still watching me with that strange, almost nostalgic expression. He looked like a man who had just remembered a story he thought he'd forgotten. "Mrs. Price," he said, "you may be seated." "I already am," I answered softly. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Even he smiled. For a second I felt a spark, a whisper of the woman I used to be before grief and age taught me to shrink. That spark would matter later, more than anyone knew, because that moment, that small exchange, was the first crack in the wall they'd built around me. As the lawyers began their opening statements, I let my gaze drift to Lucas. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched. He looked miserable. Maybe part of him still remembered who I was. The woman who stayed up sewing his Halloween costume. The one who sold cupcakes at church fundraiser so he could go to college. But guilt fades fast when someone keeps whispering in your ear that money fixes everything. Vivian placed her manicured hand on his and whispered something I couldn't hear. He nodded again, same as before, half agreement, half surrender. And I knew right then the boy I raised was gone. But the woman who raised him, she was just getting started. The sound of the gavel echoed once more. I looked up, meeting the judge's eyes again. For a heartbeat the noise faded, the voices blurred, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat steadying strong. They thought I was just an old woman with nothing left to lose. I whispered under my breath. I turned my gaze toward Vivian, calm, unwavering. They were wrong. And that's how it began. 8 months of silence, humiliation, and betrayal had led me to that single room. And as I sat there, surrounded by people who underestimated me, I realized something no one else in that courtroom could see. This wasn't my downfall. It was my return. Every morning starts the same way for me. The kettle whistles before the sun's even up, and I pour my tea into that old cracked cup, the one Richard chipped years ago and swore he'd fix but never did. I used to think about buying a new set, something shiny and proper, but somehow this one feels more honest. It's lived a life. Like me. The house is quiet, the kind of quiet that hums. The neighbor's sprinklers start up. The dog barks down the street, and I talk to my orchids while I water them. Richard loved those flowers. "You and your fragile things," he used to tease, handing me a towel while pretending not to notice the soil on the counter. I told him orchids weren't fragile, they were patient. They bloom when they're ready, not when the world tells them to. Sometimes when I touch the leaves I can still hear him in the kitchen, humming off key, fixing something that didn't really need fixing. That was Richard. Never met a floorboard he didn't think needed tightening. I remember one afternoon he was on his knees with a hammer, smiling like he'd found buried treasure under the wood. "If these floors could talk," he said, "they'd sing your name." I laughed and told him he was ridiculous. But he just grinned and said, "You'll see. Now the boards creak under my feet when I walk, and it almost feels like they're whispering back." 40 years in this house, you collect more than dust. You collect moments. Scratches on the doorframe where Lucas marked his height every summer. A stain on the wall from that time he tried to make spaghetti on his own. The faint smell of Richard's aftershave that somehow never quite left the hallway. People think homes get old, but I think they just get full. When Lucas left for college, I thought that was the finish line. I'd done it. Raised a good boy, kept a roof over his head, made sure he never saw me cry over bills or tired bones. I'd scrubbed floors for people who never learned my name, stayed up sewing dresses that sold for more than my week's pay. I told myself it was all worth it, that one day I'd rest and finally live for me. But when graduation came and I stood there in the crowd watching him take that diploma, something in me shifted. Pride, yes, but also this small ache like I'd handed over the last piece of myself. When he hugged me afterward, his voice full of excitement and new plans, I smiled and said, "Go make me proud." What I didn't say was, who am I now, if not your mother holding everything together? It's funny, you spend decades being the glue, and then one day you realize no one remembers what held the pieces. The days got quieter after Richard passed. At first, I kept expecting him to walk through the door, his hands covered in sawdust, complaining about how the hardware store raised prices again. I still catch myself setting out 2 cups sometimes. Old habits die hard. There's a soft spot in the hallway where the floor dips slightly. The same board Richard replaced the year we couldn't afford new furniture. He said, "Doesn't matter what's on top, Ellie. What matters is the foundation." I didn't understand then how deep that line would go. Because years later, when everything else started to crumble, money, patience, even family, I found myself standing on that same floor, steady because he built it right. The mornings now are small rituals stitched together. Boil the water. Pour the tea. Talk to the orchids. Sit by the window and watch the world hurry past while mine moves slow. There's peace in that, I guess, the kind that doesn't shout. Sometimes Lucas calls, usually short conversations between meetings. "You doing okay, Mom?" he asks, his voice full of distraction. I always say I'm fine, honey, because that's what mothers say. But the truth sits heavy in the room after the line goes dead. The truth is I miss the sound of him moving through this house. The doors slamming, the laughter, the mess. I miss being needed. I walk into his old room sometimes, not to cry, just to remember. The posters are gone, the trophies packed away. But there's still a dent on the bed where he used to sit tying his shoes. Funny how even air can keep a memory if it's loved long enough. People tell me I should downsize, find a smaller place, something easier. But I don't want easier. I want familiar. This house isn't a burden. It's a map. Every room leads back to who I used to be. When I look at the cracked cup in my hands, I don't see something broken. I see mornings shared, laughter spilled, Richard's fingerprints still faint on the handle. When I water the orchids, I don't see aging petals. I see proof that life continues if you care for it quietly enough. And when I walk over those creaking floors, I hear his voice, steady, patient, certain, reminding me that even wood remembers love. I thought after 40 years I'd finally done my job as a mother. What I didn't realize was how much of myself I traded for everyone else's comfort. Somewhere between making lunches, paying bills, and saying yes when I wanted to rest, I'd turned invisible. But maybe that's why I keep these little rituals alive. Because they remind me that I still exist, in the sound of the kettle, the bloom of an orchid, the hum of a floor that once sang my name. I spent the whole afternoon in the kitchen, stirring that old pot of beef stew Lucas used to love when he was little. The smell filled the house the way laughter used to. Back when Richard and I would sit here, watching our boy chase his toy cars across the floor. Funny how something as simple as stew can make time bend. One minute you're young and busy. The next you're standing over the same stove, older, quieter, still trying to keep the family warm. When I heard their car pull up, I smoothed my apron and took a breath. I wanted tonight to feel easy, familiar. I even set the table with the blue plates Richard bought at a yard sale 20 years ago. He said they made dinner feel like Sunday no matter the day. Lucas came in first, smiling that careful smile people wear when they've got bad news but don't want to start with it. "Hey Mom," he said, kissing my cheek. "Smells amazing." Vivian followed. her perfume reaching the room before she did. She looked beautiful, of course. She always does. But there's something about her beauty that feels cold, like glass that never warms no matter how bright the light hits it. "Dinner's ready," I said. "I made your favorite Lucas." He smiled again, a little tighter this time. "You didn't have to go through all that trouble." "I wanted to," I told him. "Some habits are worth keeping." We sat down. I tried to start the kind of small talk mothers always do. Asked about his work, her new business, the weather in the city. But the air felt thick, like we were all waiting for the real conversation to begin. Vivian pushed her food around with her spoon, barely tasting it. Then she looked up, her voice too calm, too rehearsed. "Mom," she said, "this house is just a lot for you to manage, don't you think? The upkeep, the bills. It's too much. Lucas and I talked and we think it's time we handled things for you." She said handled like it was charity, like I was a burden that needed to be boxed and labeled. Lucas didn't look at me. He stared at his bowl, silent, pretending to listen to her words as if they didn't come from both of them. For a second I couldn't speak. The spoon slipped from my hand and clinked against the table. I looked at my son, the same boy who once cried when he broke my teacup, because he said he didn't want to hurt something that mattered. Now he couldn't even meet my eyes. "Handle it?" I repeated softly. "What exactly does that mean?" Vivian folded her napkin neatly, like she was giving a presentation. "Well, we could sell the place, find you something smaller. Something safer. You shouldn't have to worry about maintenance or being alone here." The way she said alone, as if it was my fault. I leaned back, trying to steady my voice. "This house isn't too big for me, dear. You've just outgrown gratitude." Her eyebrows shot up. Lucas finally looked at me, his lips parting, but no words came out. Vivian cleared her throat, forcing a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "We're just trying to help, Eleanor. No need to make it emotional." "No," I said, still calm, "you're not trying to help. You're trying to erase." For a long moment no one spoke. You could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, the one Richard fixed a dozen times because he said silence made a house feel lonely. Lucas finally muttered, "Maybe we should talk about this another time." "Yes," I said, "you should." He stood up quickly, grateful for the escape. Vivian followed, placing her napkin neatly beside her plate like she was done with more than just dinner. At the door, Lucas turned back. "Mom, please don't be upset. We're just thinking about what's best for you." I wanted to tell him that what's best for me isn't always what's easiest for him, but I didn't. I just nodded because sometimes silence says more than anger ever could. When the door closed behind them, the house felt heavier than before. I looked at the two untouched bowls of stew cooling on the table. Richard's chair sat empty as it had for years, but tonight it seemed emptier. I could almost see him sitting there, arms crossed, that patient smile on his face. The one that said, "Let them talk, Ellie. They'll learn soon enough." The sound of the wind crept through the cracks of the window. The clock ticked on. I gathered the dishes, rinsed them one by one, and tried not to let the tears fall into the sink. When I finished, I wiped the table clean, folded my apron, and walked down the hall to Richard's old study. I hadn't been inside in months. The door still smelled like varnish and cedar. His smell. I stood there for a moment, staring at his desk, papers stacked neatly, his old reading glasses still resting on top of an unfinished crossword puzzle. I could almost hear him asking, 5 letters, starts with F, ends with H. "What's the word, Ellie?" "Faith," I whispered. Then I turned the key in the lock. It clicked softly, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. I slipped the key into my pocket. They could talk about selling my house all they wanted, but some doors in this life stay closed for a reason. He showed up on a Tuesday morning. Some man I'd never seen before, wearing a polo shirt and holding one of those laser measuring gadgets. Didn't even bother introducing himself properly. Just a quick, "Morning, ma'am," before he started pacing through my hallway like he owned the place. Vivian was right behind him, heels clicking on the hardwood like gunfire. She was smiling, polite, too sweet, the kind of sweet that makes your teeth ache. "Don't mind us, Mom," she said. "We're just getting a sense of the property's value. In case we make any decisions later." I didn't answer. I just watched the man stretch his tape across the living room window, jotting down numbers like he was calculating my worth. Every beep of his little device felt like an insult. Vivian wrinkled her nose. "Old houses always smell like dust and regret," she said, half laughing. "Then maybe you should breathe somewhere else," I murmured. Not loud enough to start a fight, just loud enough for the walls to hear me. She didn't catch it, or maybe she chose not to. That's the thing about people like her. They only hear what flatters them. The appraiser, if that's even what he was, moved to the kitchen next, running his hand along the counter I'd polished that morning. "You've kept this place in good shape," he said. Vivian jumped in before I could respond. "For now, yes, but it's too much for her. The plumbing's ancient, the roof leaks. It's just old." I felt the heat rise in my chest. That counter wasn't just old. It was the same one where Richard taught Lucas how to make pancakes on Saturday mornings. The same counter where I rolled out pie dough when times were hard, and where Richard once left a note that said, "Don't worry, we'll figure it out." They didn't see that. They saw tile and resale value. The man nodded, scribbled something in his folder, and asked to see upstairs. Vivian motioned like she was giving a tour, all smiles and gestures. I followed behind, silent. My hand brushed the wooden banister Richard had sanded himself. He'd been so proud of it. Real wood, Ellie. None of that cheap veneer. Halfway up, one of the steps creaked beneath the man's foot. "These stairs could use reinforcement," he said. Vivian smirked. "That's what I've been saying." I bit my tongue. The sound of that creak used to mean life in this house. Richard carrying boxes, Lucas running late for school, me calling after them. Now it was just another thing on her list of flaws. When they reached the landing, Vivian stepped into my bedroom doorway, eyes scanning everything like a critic at a gallery. "You could fit 2 condos in here," she said. "It's just wasted space for one person." I looked past her, to the corner where Richard's chair still sat by the window. His reading glasses were there too, exactly where he'd left them the day before his last hospital trip. Dust had settled on the arms, sure, but I couldn't bring myself to move them. It was his spot, the quiet part of the house where he'd hum old songs under his breath, pretending not to watch me fold laundry. The appraiser cleared his throat. "All right, I think I've seen enough." Vivian clasped her hands together like she'd just closed a business deal. "Perfect. I'll have my attorney contact you about the report." I blinked. Her attorney? It hit me then, this wasn't about helping. It was about control. She'd already been planning this behind my back, probably using Lucas's name on the paperwork. When Richard and I bought this house, we'd put both our names on the deed. And later, when Lucas turned 21, Richard added him too. Said it would make things simpler one day. He never imagined that simpler would mean someone else pretending my life was theirs to rearrange. Vivian wasn't just scheming, she was clever. She forged something, I could feel it. Maybe a document, maybe a signature. Something small, but enough to make me look powerless if I pushed back. That's why I hadn't called the police, even though every cell in me screamed to, because on paper this house didn't just belong to me anymore. And if she played her cards right, she could spin it into a story about an unstable widow refusing to let go. No, I had to be smart, quiet, like Richard always said. "Don't swing at every pitch, Ellie. Wait for the one you can hit clean." The man folded his clipboard and nodded politely before leaving. "Good luck with the sale, ma'am," he said. I didn't bother correcting him. Let him think whatever he wanted. Vivian lingered in the doorway, adjusting her coat. "We'll be in touch," she said with that smile. The kind that hides a knife. "Try not to worry. Change is a good thing." "Funny," I said softly, "you don't look like someone who enjoys change." Her smile froze for a second before she turned and walked away. The front door shut with a click that echoed through every room. When the sound finally faded, I stood there alone in the hallway, staring at the walls. My fingers brushed the spot where Richard's handprint had once stained the paint. He'd been fixing the light fixture that week. The wood felt warm under my palm, almost alive. I went to the kitchen, pulled open the drawer by the stove, and took out my small leather notebook. The pages smelled faintly of cinnamon and dust, the scent of a life lived long enough to matter. I flipped to the first blank page and wrote slowly, deliberately, "If they want my home, they'll have to fight for it." The ink bled a little, like the paper itself understood the promise. I closed the book and slid it back into the drawer, right beside Richard's old measuring tape. Outside, I heard Vivian's car pull away. The house settled around me, creaking like an old friend stretching its arms after being disrespected. I smiled to myself, the first real smile in weeks. Let them measure the walls, count the windows, talk about market value. They didn't know this place like I did. They didn't know what was buried deep in its foundation. Loyalty, love, and a woman who wasn't done fighting yet. They came back the next morning, Vivian with a folder tucked under her arm and a man in a navy suit following close behind. I didn't need an introduction to know he was a lawyer. You can always tell by the way they look around a room, like everything's already evidence. "Mom," Vivian started, her tone syrupy but sharp underneath, "we just need to take care of some paperwork. Nothing complicated." She set the folder down on the kitchen table where I'd once served birthday cakes and late-night soups. Now it looked like a battlefield. The lawyer slid a few pages toward me. "This is just a transfer document, Mrs. Price. It's in your best interest. Simplifies things, protects the estate, all standard procedure." Vivian smiled tightly. "If you don't sign, Mom, the state could declare you unfit. And then Lucas would have to step in as your legal guardian anyway. This just saves everyone time." Her words hung in the air like poison gas. Calm, professional, deadly. I looked from her face to the papers. My name was printed neatly at the bottom. All it needed was a signature, one small surrender. Lucas stood behind her, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the floor. "Lucas," I said softly, "do you really believe that?" He hesitated. For a moment I thought I saw the boy he used to be, the one who once defended me when kids in the grocery store called me old-fashioned. But then he looked away. "It's just what's best, Mom," he mumbled. "What's best?" That phrase again. Everyone thinks they know what's best for you once you've got gray hair. My hands trembled as I picked up the pen. The metal felt cold, heavier than it should have. The room blurred, walls, faces, even the light seemed to fade. All I could see was Richard's handwriting on the old grocery list still pinned to the fridge. He used to write little hearts next to the milk and coffee, saying it was his way of reminding me to love the small things. Now there were no hearts, just signatures and threats dressed as concern. I pressed the pen to the paper, the tip leaving a faint dot of ink. My fingers started to move. A line, the beginning of my name, when something caught my eye. The hallway mirror across from the table. It was old like everything else in this house, with tiny cracks webbing through the glass. I saw myself in it, pale, tired, smaller than I remembered. My reflection looked like a woman fading out of her own life. And behind that reflection, I could almost see Richard's study door, still locked, still waiting. That was the moment it hit me. I had been shrinking little by little for years, saying yes when I wanted to scream no, smiling through insults, letting time erase my edges. And now they were asking me to erase the last piece of myself. I looked at the pen in my hand, then back at my reflection. My voice came out quiet, steady, almost unfamiliar. "Enough." Vivian froze mid-sentence. "What?" I set the pen down carefully, lining it up with the papers like it belonged to someone else. I said enough, I repeated louder this time. My voice didn't shake. "You can't threaten me with my own life." Lucas blinked, startled. "Mom, please." "No," I said. "Don't mom me now. You think being old means being helpless. You think I don't understand what's happening here? I may be slow, but I'm not stupid." Vivian crossed her arms, mask slipping. "We're just trying to help. Help yourselves," I finished for her. "That's what this is." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, closing his folder. Perhaps we should give Mrs. Price more time. You should, I said. Because no one's signing anything today. Vivian's face hardened. Mom, you don't have the authority to. Then take me to court, I cut in. Let them look at me, talk to me, and tell me I'm unfit. Go ahead. The silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. Even the air conditioner stopped humming. Finally, Vivian snatched the papers off the table, her jaw tight. Fine. We'll do it the hard way. Lucas hesitated a moment longer, eyes flicking toward me. I'll call you tomorrow, he whispered. You won't, I said quietly. Not until you remember who you're calling. They left without another word. The door slammed, rattling the picture frames on the wall. I stood there for a long time, staring at the space where the folder had been. My hand still shook, but something in me felt steady for the first time in years. I walked over to the mirror again. The woman staring back wasn't weak. She was weathered, yes, lines carved by years of love, loss, and survival, but her eyes were clear. Enough, I whispered again, this time to her. And she nodded back. That night the wind wouldn't stop. It pressed against the windows, slipped through the cracks, whispered through the house like a restless ghost. I couldn't sleep. Every room felt haunted. Not by spirits but by silence. The kind that makes you realize how empty a home becomes when love leaves it. I walked barefoot through the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my weight. They'd always done that, even back when Richard was alive. He used to tease me about it. One day he'd say, crouched down with his hammer and that proud little grin, "This floor will keep you safe." I'd roll my eyes and tell him he was sentimental to a fault. He'd just wink and keep hammering. I never understood what he meant. Not until that night. As I passed the living room, one of the boards near the fireplace groaned louder than usual. The sharp, uneven sound. I stopped, pressed my foot down again. Another creak. Then a small crack. I knelt, feeling along the grain, and my fingers brushed against a loose edge. The wood shifted slightly, like it had been waiting for me to notice. My heart started pounding. Carefully, I lifted the board, and underneath, tucked into a shallow space wrapped in an old handkerchief, was a small tin box. I stared at it for a long moment before I touched it. It was light but cold, like it had been holding its breath all these years. When I finally opened it, the smell of old paper and cedar filled the air. Inside was a folded letter, a few official-looking documents, and something else. The photo of Richard and me from the early days, standing in front of this very house. His arm around my shoulder. Both of us smiling like we'd just built heaven with our own hands. My throat tightened as I unfolded the letter. His handwriting hadn't changed, drawn careful, full of loops and patience. "If you're reading this, Ellie," it began, "it means you're standing alone where we built our dreams. Don't be afraid. I knew one day this house might become more than a home. It might have to be your armor. Everything I leave here is yours. Use it not to punish but to protect. You were always stronger than you believed." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I pressed the paper to my chest, shaking, whispering his name like a prayer. Underneath the letter were the documents, property deeds, stock certificates, accounts I'd never known existed. Richard had always been modest about money, always said we had just enough. But here it was. Proof that he'd been planning, building, protecting long after I'd stopped expecting anything but quiet survival. There was a smaller note tucked inside the folder, dated just months before he passed. "If anyone ever tries to take what we built, remember, truth doesn't need permission to stand tall." That's when I broke. The months of humiliation, the fear, the shame, all of it cracked open like that loose floorboard. I sobbed, not just for the cruelty of what Lucas and Vivian had done, but for every day I'd spent doubting myself. For every time I thought I was too old, too tired, too small to fight back. I could almost hear Richard's voice again, steady and teasing. "Told you this floor would keep you safe." I laughed through the tears, shaking my head. "You old fool," I whispered. "You always had one more surprise." The wind outside softened, almost like it was listening. The house, for the first time in months, felt alive again. Not just wood and nails, but heart and memory. Every creak was a heartbeat. Every wall seemed to lean in closer. I spread the documents across the table, the papers trembling under the flickering lamplight. One of them was the deed to this house, and there in black ink were both our names. And beneath his signature, something I'd never noticed before: joint ownership with survivorship rights. It meant everything was mine now, legally, irrevocably. Vivian's little plan to sell my life out from under me was built on sand. I let out a shaky breath. My reflection in the window looked different, tired, yes, but there was something else in my eyes. Something sharp. Something alive. The woman who stared back wasn't the one who'd nearly signed her home away. She wasn't the one who'd stood silent while people measured her worth in square footage. She was the woman Richard had written to, the one he knew was stronger than she believed. I gathered the papers, folded the letter carefully, and placed them back into the tin box. Then I slid the board back into place, pressing it down until it fit perfectly, as if it had never been lifted. But now I knew. That floor wasn't hiding a secret anymore. It was holding a promise. As I turned off the lamp and looked toward the hallway, I could almost see Richard's shadow by the doorway. That easy smile, that steady posture. "You've got this, Ellie," he'd say. "You always did." I smiled through the tears and whispered, "Thank you." For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. I felt ready. They came back on a gray morning, the kind that smells like rain before it falls. I heard the truck before I saw it. The rumble of tires, the clatter of metal ramps, boxes, movers, voices. The sound of strangers touching your life. I didn't move right away. I just sat at the kitchen table, pouring tea into my old cracked cup. The same one Richard once said was lucky because it survived everything. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had to. Vivian walked in first, all confidence and perfume, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Mom, we brought a crew to help you pack. Let's make this easy, okay?" Behind her, Lucas followed, not meeting my eyes, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I could see the guilt rolling off him like fog, but he said nothing. I took a sip of tea, slow and calm. "You might want to stop unloading," I said softly. Vivian blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" "The boxes," I said, motioning to the men hauling them inside. "You might want to put them back. You've been paying rent to me, not the bank." Her smile faltered, but she forced to laugh. "What are you talking about?" I set the cup down and reached for the folder sitting beside me. My hands didn't shake this time. I opened it, laid the papers neatly on the table. Property deeds. Certificates. Richard's name and mine printed clear as daylight. Vivian's laugh died in her throat. Her color drained like she'd seen a ghost. Lucas stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Dad left all this to you?" I met his eyes. "No, dear. He left it to the woman who never sold her soul." The room went still. You could hear the tick of the clock and the sound of one of the movers clearing his throat, realizing he'd walked into something he didn't want to be part of. Vivian tried to recover, her tone turning sharp. "You can't be serious. There's no way this is real." "Then by all means," I said, sliding one of the documents toward her, "call your lawyer. Or better yet, your bank. Ask them who's been cashing your rent checks for the last 2 years. Lucas reached for the paper, his hands trembling as he read. His face went pale. Vivian snatched it from him, scanning line after line, searching for a loophole that didn't exist. "This can't be right," she said, voice cracking. "You wouldn't hide something like this." I looked at her, steady. "I didn't hide anything. Your father did. He wanted to make sure you'd learn what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness." Vivian stared at me, jaw tight. "So what now? You're just going to kick us out?" I smiled faintly. "No, honey. I'm going to let the truth do it for me." The air between us thickened. The movers shuffled awkwardly, waiting for a cue that never came. Lucas finally spoke, voice small, broken. We didn't mean for it to go this far, Mom. We just thought that I was too old, too tired, too naive to fight back. I interrupted gently. You thought wrong. He opened his mouth but no words came out. Vivian straightened her posture, trying to gather what little control she had left. This isn't fair, she said, almost whispering. Fair? I repeated. Fair was 40 years of my life keeping this family together. Fair was working double shifts so you could have your dream wedding. Fair was burying my husband alone while you two argued over who would inherit the house he built with his hands. I picked up my cup again, holding it between my palms. The tea had gone cold, but it didn't matter. You see, Vivian, you can take my house but not my peace. Her face hardened, but there was fear in her eyes now, real fear. Not of losing property, but of realizing she'd already lost something far greater. Lucas looked at me like he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. Maybe he didn't. Maybe for the first time he was seeing me without the labels, not mom, not burden, not old. Just a person who had reached her limit and decided not to apologize for it. I stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor. The sound was sharp, final. You'll have 30 days to make other arrangements, I said quietly. After that, the locks change. Mom, please, Lucas whispered, stepping toward me. We made a mistake. I made a mistake. I know, I said. And one day maybe we'll find a way to fix it. But not today. He nodded, tears in his eyes. Vivian just stared at the papers, as if willing them to disappear. As they turned to leave, I looked around the room. The faded wallpaper, the old clock, the floor Richard once promised would keep me safe. Everything was exactly as it had always been, yet somehow completely new. When the door closed behind them, I poured what was left of my tea down the sink and rinsed the cup carefully. The crack ran along its side, same as always, but it still held. So did I. Vivian's voice cut through the room like glass shattering. You're out of your mind, she snapped. You're just a delusional old woman who can't let go. The words echoed sharp and ugly. For a second, even the air felt embarrassed. Lucas stood frozen, his face pale. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but Vivian kept going. You think you can just twist everything around, make yourself the victim? This house, this drama. It's all in your head. I didn't flinch. I'd been called worse. The difference was this time I wasn't the one shrinking from the noise. Lucas finally spoke, his voice low but steady. Enough, Viv. She spun toward him. Excuse me? He took a step forward. I said enough. She's my mother. That stopped her cold. The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, even the rain starting against the windows. Vivian's jaw tightened. Oh, I see what's happening. She's turning you against me. That's what this has all been about. No, Lucas said, his voice cracking slightly. You did that yourself. Her eyes darted between us, disbelief and rage wrestling for space. Unbelievable, she hissed. You're both insane. Then she grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door, heels stabbing into the wood with every step. The slam rattled the walls and sent the picture frames tilting slightly askew. When the house finally went quiet again, Lucas just stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes wet but not from tears, more like exhaustion. I poured another cup of tea, set it in front of him. He didn't drink it, just stared at it like it was some kind of peace offering he didn't deserve. You were always kind, Lucas, I said softly. You just forgot who taught you that. He looked up, his voice barely a whisper. I don't even know when it happened. When I started treating you like a burden instead of Mom. I smiled, faint but real. That's the thing about losing yourself. It happens one compromise at a time. He rubbed his face, shaking his head. Vivian said I was supposed to take care of you, that you couldn't handle being alone. And did you ever stop to ask if I wanted that? He didn't answer. The rain outside grew heavier, blurring the lights from the street. It was the kind of night that makes everything feel smaller. like the whole world narrows down to the sound of breathing in one quiet house. Lucas exhaled long and shaky. I don't want to go home tonight. I can't. I leaned back in my chair. Home, I repeated. Funny how that word changes depending on who's saying it. He nodded, eyes down. Can I stay here, Mom? Just for tonight. The part of me that had waited years for him to come back wanted to say yes right away. But another part, the one that had been bruised and left to stand alone, needed to be honest. One night I said finally. My voice was steady but not warm. Tomorrow we start fixing what you broke. He looked up, nodding slowly. I understand. I gathered the cups, rinsed them under the tap. The water ran hot, steaming against my hands. Behind me, I heard him moving through the living room, the floor creaking under his familiar weight. It had been so long since I'd heard that sound. Later, when the house had settled and the storm softened to a drizzle, I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker in the wet pavement. The reflection in the glass was a face I barely recognized. Older, yes, but not defeated. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost haunting my own home. I felt awake. You spend your whole life giving, thinking that love means endurance. But sometimes love means standing up, even if your knees shake. Tomorrow would bring more talking, more fixing, more pain probably. But tonight it was enough to know the cycle had cracked. The line had been drawn. I turned off the light, whispering into the dark, more to myself than to anyone else. You're never too old to start again. And for the first time in months I believed it. The courtroom was colder than I remembered. Not from the air conditioning, but from the way silence pressed against every wall. Vivian sat across from me, perfectly composed, like she was auditioning for sympathy. Her lawyer shuffled papers dramatically, as if noise could make their lies sound true. She had filed a suit against me, claimed I'd fraudulently seized assets, manipulated her husband and stolen what wasn't mine. I'd almost laughed when I read it. Almost. Lucas sat beside me, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't said much since that night, but his presence was louder than any apology could have been. When the bailiff called my name, I stood. My knees didn't shake this time. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the file before him. Then, when his eyes met mine, something shifted. Ms. Price, he said slowly, his voice uncertain. You once worked in my father's office, didn't you? The room froze. Even the lawyers looked up. I nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Back when you were an intern, you used to stay late to finish case notes because you wanted to prove you belonged. He leaned back, a faint, almost nostalgic smile flickering across his face. You helped me write my first brief, he said quietly. You told me to always remember that the law isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who stands the longest. The murmur rippled through the courtroom. Vivian shifted in her chair, uncomfortable for the first time since the hearing began. The judge straightened his posture, clearing his throat. Please continue, counsel. Vivian's lawyer launched into his argument, all pomp and volume. Your Honor, this woman, while elderly and emotionally unstable, took advantage of her late husband's estate, deceiving both her son and his wife into believing she required their care. I didn't react. I just folded my hands and let the storm pass. When it was my turn, my attorney stood, but I gently touched her arm. It's all right, I said. I can speak for myself. I stepped forward. Your Honor, I began. For most of my life I thought survival meant silence. I built my home with my husband's hands and raised my son under its roof. When he left, I didn't complain. When he forgot, I didn't chase. And when they tried to take what was mine, I didn't scream. I simply remembered who I was. The lawyer scoffed. Touching but irrelevant. The judge raised a hand. Let her speak. I looked straight at Vivian. You thought age meant weakness. But it's funny. Time doesn't make us smaller, it sharpens us. You can buy new floors, new walls, but you can't replace the woman who built the home that taught you what love was. She rolled her eyes. Oh please. Do you know what this house is made of? I said. Wood and memory. Sweat and hope. Every nail in it was driven by faith. That's what you tried to sell. For once she had no reply. The judge looked down at the documents in front of him. Deeds, signatures, Richard's old letter. And then back up at me. His expression softened. This woman doesn't need protection, he said finally, his voice steady. She's protection. The gavel came down. The sound echoed through the room like thunder breaking open the sky. Vivian's lawyer sputtered something about appeals, but the judge was already signing the order. All assets, home shares, accounts restored to my name. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. Lucas turned to me, his voice trembling. Mom, you did it. I smiled faintly. No, son. We did it. We remembered. As Vivian gathered her things, avoiding my eyes, I almost pitied her. Almost. When the bailiff opened the door, I caught the judge's gaze one last time. He nodded politely, but I could see something else in his expression, respect. The kind a person carries for someone who taught them what strength looks like long before they had to find it themselves. Outside, sunlight hit the marble steps, and for the first time it felt warm again. Lucas reached for my hand and I let him. It's over, he said quietly. I looked at him, at the courthouse behind us, at the sky stretching wide and clean above. No, I said softly. It's just beginning. 3 years passed, and the house that once held silence now hummed with life again. The front porch had been repainted, the garden bloomed wild with color, and the small brass sign by the mailbox read, "The Safe Home Project." It started as an idea, one letter, one conversation, one woman saying me too. Now it was a network of volunteers, lawyers, and neighbors helping older women who'd been pushed aside, silenced, or stripped of what they built. A place where dignity wasn't something you had to beg for. Inside, the kitchen smelled like lavender and lemon soap. Lucas sat at the table, sleeves rolled up, reviewing grant applications. He looked up as I walked in with 2 mugs of tea. You know, he said, smiling faintly, for a nonprofit we're doing pretty well. Dad would have been proud. I set his cup down, glancing at the corner where the old violet plant stood in full bloom. He already is, I said. The flowers had been stubborn for years, barely growing, always drooping. But now they stretched tall and open, soft purple petals catching the sunlight that spilled through the window. Lucas followed my gaze. Guess it finally decided to live again. I smiled. So did we. A knock came at the door. A young volunteer dropping off donations. Behind her, a little girl stood holding a drawing. She was maybe 8, with messy curls and eyes too curious for her age. Mrs. Price, she asked shyly, pointing to the shelf, "Why do you still keep that broken teacup?" I turned toward the cup. The same one that had seen everything. The crack down its side had deepened over the years, but it still stood proudly on the shelf, patched once with a bit of gold resin Lucas had brought home from a workshop. Because, I said, crouching down to her level, cracks don't ruin you. They just prove you've survived. The girl thought for a second, then nodded like she understood more than she should have at her age. After she left, Lucas came over, leaning on the counter. "You really love that cup, don't you? It reminds me that we're not meant to be flawless," I said softly. "We're meant to be strong. There's a difference." He reached out, placing a hand over mine. "I'm sorry it took me this long to learn that from you. You learned it when you came home," I said. "That's all that mattered." Outside, the sound of laughter drifted in. Women from the support group sharing coffee on the porch, telling stories that no longer ended in shame. The wind carried the scent of the violets through the open window, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a fortress. Felt like a promise. The voice in my head, the same one that used to whisper fear, was quiet now, replaced by something stronger, simpler. Power isn't about fighting louder, I thought. It's about knowing when to stand, even if you're standing alone. Because sometimes standing alone is what teaches others they can, too. And as the afternoon sun dipped behind the trees, the light hit that cracked teacup just right, and for a moment it gleamed like gold. If this story touched your heart, share it. For every mother who built a home and was told she didn't belong there anymore. For every woman who was silenced, dismissed, or made to feel small. Because respect isn't something you earn with age. It's something you've already built with love, sacrifice, and strength. And no one should ever have to fight for the right to be seen.